Well, thank you for everyone for coming back. We're on the home stretch. We have 2 more left to go. Has everyone been blessed?
Oh.
Have you learned something?
Yes.
Yeah, I learned something new every single time. So it's really amazing. Just the many ways there are to heal. So with that, we're going to start our next presentation on generational trauma. So introducing David Jones.
All right. Well, thank you. This is where I'm not supposed to embarrass my wife by saying that's my beautiful wife up there, but I did it anyway. All right. Well, welcome. Glad you all can make it again for this afternoon. Today, the talk is going to be on overcoming generational trauma. Now, sometimes we take for granted that we can inherit things from our relatives and even farther up the chain. I remember one of my first introductions to this is not just that my children have some of my physical features and some of my wife's physical features, but they do some of the things that we do. And I remember when our kids were only 2 years old, I remember watching one of my kiddos sit on the couch, and I have something that I kind of do when I'm sitting down and relaxing. I kind of move my feet in a certain way while I'm relaxing. And I watched my kid do the exact same thing. And I never taught him that, and we didn't have a lesson. It's like, all right, kid, now when you want to relax, you're going to just wiggle your feet like this because it's for some reason that's soothing to you. But it also turns out that I didn't originate that because whenever I go to my mom's house, I watch her and she sits down and she moves her feet in the exact same pattern. And it's just kind of weird. It's like, why do we do that? Like, how is it that something like that can be taught? Some of my favorite studies have been even some of these identical twin studies. I don't know if you've heard about some of these incidents where twins were separated at birth, but then met each other later in life. So one of the most famous cases is the case of the Jim twins. So they're both named James. So they both went by Jim though, and they met in their, I believe in their mid-30s or late 20s. And when they met, they had some surprises. Now they were actually just raised probably about 30 or 40 miles apart, and they never met each other the whole time. But when they met, there's several things that they had in common. One of them is that both worked at McDonald's, and they both ended up being managers at McDonald's. Then after that, they both had a dog that they named Toy. Then each of them owned a blue Chevrolet, the exact same model blue Chevrolet. And then they both married a woman named Rebecca. Now, this wasn't the same Rebecca, but they both married women named Rebecca. Then they both divorced Rebecca's, and then they both married a woman with the exact same name afterwards. I'm just going to make it up right now because I can't remember the name, and I believe the name was Amber. And then after they had been married to that second wife, after they had met, one of the Jim twins divorced Amber, and the other Amber was kind of nervous because with the track record so far, this ain't looking so hot. But anyway, they did stay married, but it was just incredible. All these things happened. Yeah, they were separated at birth, but they're identical twins. And so sharing their genetics did more than just make them look the same. It actually affected their behaviors. So genes don't just tell you how to look, they also influence how you act. And that's really incredible that it goes that deep. In fact, just one little mind-blowing fact about twins. Does anybody know any identical twins, or like have any friends or met somebody's identical twin before? Okay, so you all have probably heard about this before, but when an egg is fertilized, an egg will kind of divide into 2, and then that 2 turns to 4, and then to 8, 16, and so on. When an identical twin happens, it's when the cell starts to divide. This is one fertilized egg, which is all of us started this way, but then it just divides a little too far and separates. So a twin is an individual person divided into 2. So that means every single one of you could have had a twin if it just split a little further. So if you ever wonder what it would be like if you had a clone, that's what twins are. It's the same person split in 2. Wow. Well, I'll come back to questions, but make sure to drop questions down. But yes, but just let that sit in your mind for a moment. So genetics can do some very interesting things. And today we're going to look at how genetics can play out in a generational pattern. So our objectives for today are going to be to understand intergenerational trauma, to identify the major themes and narratives of intergenerational trauma. We're going to look at some of the insights into how you change your own inherited narratives, because every one of us is handed a story. And for my son, it was more than just moving his foot around in a particular pattern. There's other stories that he's going to get from me too, ones that I don't even have to verbalize. And we're going to take a look at how that works. Then we're going to look at how to apply the extra technique. So if you haven't something to write your notes with, you just want to write down that acronym extra, because we're going to see what that actually means. So these will be strategies that we'll walk through with this extra technique. Okay. So let's just do some definitions first. So the word generation, to generate something means to bring something forth, right? And the reason I put the word generation there is because in that word, if you take the first 4 letters of generation, what word do you see there? You take the first 4 letters. Gene, right? So when we talk about your genes, that's what we're talking about. It's just the word kind of cut off from generation. So your genes are what were generated by your parents. That make sense so far? So that's what your genes are. The word gene also means to give birth, to beget, and it has some derivatives that refer to procreation, to family and tribal groups, but that's where the word gene and generation come from. So when you hear about things that are in your genes, this is what we are talking about. Now there's a study that's called Epigenetics. So epigenetics. So epigenetics, the word epi, so sometimes you see these terms and they can look really overwhelming. The word epi just means above, right? And so epigenetics are the things that act above the genes. So I'm going to try to illustrate this. We're going to pretend like this book is your DNA or your genes, right? Now this book cannot read itself, right? And what I read in here is kind of up to me. I can start on page 35, or I can start on page 102. Epigenetics are the things that read and pick the pages to read. Does that make sense? So if your genes are the book, your epigenes are the thing that decide what part of the book to read. Okay. All right. So does that kind of make sense? Everybody follow that so far? So this is your genes, and I would be acting as your epigenome. I'd be acting as your epigenetic kind of person, and so I would decide what pages I want to read and when. Now, some of you in school probably did what I did. I remember when I had a book report, I did not like to read a lot when I was younger. And I remember I had to do a book report in my English class. And I was kind of a procrastinator. I don't know if anybody can relate, but I like to procrastinate, wait till the last minute. And so how do you read a book that has like 180 pages and then still get it done in like 20 minutes? Now, does anybody remember, yeah, you can do Cliff Notes. Does anybody remember the books where you can do the choose your own adventure? Yes. Now, choose your own adventure books, depending on what you decide to do in chapter 1, it'll take you to a whole different place because you play out a different story. So what I would do is I'd find out which one of those would get my character killed the fastest, so then I can finish the book immediately. And so I'd pick the pages that would lead me to the conclusion that I wanted to get to. Now, in an interesting kind of way, your body works a lot the same way. It's going to skip to the pages that it thinks are going to be the most effective to use. Right? Now, I'm going to show you how this works in real time. All right. So in this picture, you can see this diagram. Kiddo over here is born with their genes. This is the book that they're given. And depending on what they do with their lifestyle, it's going to determine how this DNA is read. Right? And so if they decide to, if they eat healthy, exercise, get lots of love and nurturing, then when they grow up, they may continue to live a lifestyle of fitness and then teach that to their children. If they go the opposite way, maybe they get into like drugs and alcohol and lots of junk food, then that's going to change how the book reads. It's just like the choose your own adventure. Right? This makes sense to everyone? And so it's the same genes, same book, but different paths depending on how you decide to read it. Now, how far does this go and what does this have to do with intergenerational trauma? I want you to catch this because this is going to be true no matter what. So every one of us has genes and every one of us has been reading these genes for however length of time you've been alive. Here's the cool part though. It's never too late to choose a different adventure in your book. Right? The text is there, but you can start to decide what parts of this your life and your body starts to read. And that's why I show that picture of how lifestyle plays a factor. All right, so there's a couple of quick experiments I want to share with you. The first one is with these mice. Now, they did these experiments with these mice where they would spray the mice with cherry blossom. They spray cherry blossom scent. Anybody like the smell of cherry blossom? It's very pleasant. I think it's not pleasant. I mean, it's not what I want to smell like, but it's a pleasant smell. And what they would do though is after they sprayed the cherry blossom, then they'd electrocute them because they're scientists, and this is what scientists do. They go around hurting mice and like zapping them, cutting their heads open, finding out what's going on in their brain. Like, this is what we do to mice. But we learn a lot from it. So the mice are getting sprayed with this cherry blossom and then they zap them. All right, now this is what's called classical conditioning. So after a whole bunch of trials, maybe even like 3 or 4 of these trials where they smell cherry blossom and then they get zapped, guess how the mouse starts to feel whenever they smell the cherry blossom? They become afraid. Now, this is the same thing that's actually happening with trauma. Now, when something hurts really bad, you don't have to have it paired too many times before you get the association, right? How many people had to touch a stove more than once before you figured out that was not such a good idea, right? Okay. Yeah, some of us did, yeah. But usually not more than 10 times, okay? So most of us, it was less than 10 times before we got the message, right? That this is not a great idea. Well, it's the same thing with the mice. And so now with the mice, they actually became afraid of the cherry blossom smell. So whenever the cherry blossom came, they would try to run for cover or try to get away. They would have a natural fear response. Now that makes sense. We're all used to that. But what they weren't prepared for is that when the mice had pups, and they didn't train the pups, by the way, the pups didn't go through this. They took the pups away after the mothers had raised them, and then they sprayed the cherry blossom with the pups, and the pups were afraid. And that was kind of curious because they'd never been zapped before. And yet somehow they were afraid of the smell too. Now, if that wasn't weird enough, those pups went on to have their own pups. And they sprayed the cherry blossom with them. And guess what? Even down to the 3rd and 4th generation, they were still afraid of the smell without being taught. It was in their genetics. It's like they learned to be afraid of what their parents were afraid of, and what their great-grandparents or their grandparents were afraid of, and their great-grandparents were afraid of. Now, the way that we've also seen this in real-time history was after the Dutch famine in 1944. There were low birth rates, there were health problems, but those low birth rates and health problems during the Dutch famine also happened for their children and their children's children, even though they did not go through the famine. One little parenthetical thing I like to share at this point is sometimes the reason why we can get stuck with really hard questions that we've been wrestling with our whole lives is because that question didn't start with us. That's deep. And it's really wild. And I've watched this happen in counseling before. I'll probably give some case examples as we go along, but it really didn't start with you. Because where did you get your instructions from? Who handed you your book? That comes from your parents. Half the book comes from your dad, half the book comes from your mom. But in that book, it's not just how you look. It's also the questions you're left with and the things that you either find scary or threatening or the things you find enjoyable. It's all there in that book. Now, the good news is you can rewrite how this story plays out. And you don't even need to get new genes. You just need to start reading the story differently. All right. So let's continue here. We'll go to our next slide. So as I said, because a lot of my upbringing is within the Christian tradition, I know that there's a verse that also talks about this. This is Exodus 34:7. It talks about unto the 3rd and 4th generation. And in fact, in the book of Ezekiel, there's also a quote that says that the parents have eaten sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge. It's like they ate the grapes, but why are the children hurting from it? And it's because whatever we didn't figure out as parents, our kids oftentimes have to figure out after us. Now, it's not all bad news. Let's just think about the cherry blossom example. Let's say that cherry blossom actually is really dangerous. And as a mom rat, you don't have a lot of time to try to train your kids because you got 8 of them. And there's snakes out there and they all want to eat your kids, okay? So you don't have a lot of time to sit down at the chalkboard and be afraid of cherry blossom. So instead of having to teach your kids how to survive in the environment that you grew up in, they just inherit your fears of the environment. Also, your enjoyment of the environment too. That's why they can sometimes like similar foods and things like that. And so this is actually something that's built into nature that allows us to teach our offspring automatically how to deal with what we dealt with. So it's actually really brilliant. But sometimes it can be difficult because, like, let's say I grew up in the hood, and my kids definitely don't live in the hood right now because they live in Colfax. Like, that's not the hood. Anyway, and if they go out there with a hood mentality and they're like ready for that, but that's not what's going on, that can create some problems because now everybody's going to think that they're weird, they don't fit in culturally, all kinds of things are just not fitting. But that's because they're adapted to an environment that doesn't exist. And so the story has to change. Okay. All right. So there's a few other texts that kind of talk about this, but I'll have to forego these for right now because I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions as well as time for answers. Okay, so this part is a little bit technical, but I'll try to make it as simple as I can. There are ways that moms can pass this down to their kids, and there's ways that dads can pass down like traumas to their kids. All right, so for mothers, this one is a lot easier to kind of picture. So let's say that a mother is pregnant with her daughter. When she's pregnant with her daughter, somewhere at about, I believe it's about 26 weeks into the pregnancy, the daughter will also start to develop her own eggs, right? And she has all the eggs that she'll have for the rest of her life, which means that her daughter also has at least half of the child that she will later on have in life. So at that exact moment, when a mother is pregnant with a daughter, there are 3 generations that are all there at the same time. And there's several other things that happen too. Like during pregnancy, if a mother experiences stress, that whole epigenetic thing kicks into high gear. If she's stressed, then even the still developing child will get stress hormones dumped into it. And what will happen is when you experience stress, you ever notice that you kind of feel jittery, your body feels kind of shaky and energized? Well, the reason that happens is because all the blood is rushing to your extremities. Like you're ready to run, jump, fight, do something. Like I gave the example of the person riding up behind me in their bike, but maybe a better example is I scared my brother because we used to walk everywhere. We didn't have a car when I was younger. And so we would walk everywhere. We were walking from, it's probably like a video rental store that's dating me too. When you just have to go and pick up a VHS from a store. Anyway, so anyway, we were walking back and I ran ahead of my brother and I ducked behind a bush because I was going to scare him. And he was bouncing a basketball because we had been out all day. And he was walking with my friend. And at the last minute, I jumped out. And I was like, ah, like this. And he jumped. And then I was like, all right, joke's over now. You know, now you can be mad at me, but that's not what happened. He reeled back. He had the basketball. And I'm like this far away. And he just like threw it as hard as he can into my face. My nose was like all bloody. And I was like, dude, what are you doing? And it's because, remember, with the hand model of the brain, like he kind of flipped his lid and it did not come back on for a little bit. I thought there was plenty of time to recover and recognize this was a joke, but not so. And so I got hit in the face with that basketball. And then suddenly I also had blood going to my extremities because I was ready to do something about that. So anyway, we worked it out. We didn't get to some fist fight. I was just like, what are you doing? But that's what's happening. So when this happens, it prepares your body to fight. Now, the same thing will happen to that child that's still developing. And the way that, if blood is going out to your extremities, there's no free lunch. Your body doesn't produce extra blood. That blood is coming from somewhere. And it's actually coming from your viscera, from all your internal organs, like your stomach, and like your digestive organs. And this is part of the reason why if you're anxious a lot, it affects your appetite. Because all the blood is rushing away from like your digestive system. It's going away from like, even your immune system becomes a low priority at that point, and it rushes all the blood out to your extremities. Because if I have to choose between fighting a cold and fighting a bear, one of those is more immediate, right? But if you stay in that fighting the bear stage for too long, then your immune system can also start to take a hit. And this is part of the reason why people who end up with like chronic anxiety and stress and depression, and especially with trauma, that they have higher prevalences of cancer and heart disease and all kinds of things that sound unrelated, because your immune system is part of what helps to combat that, especially the cancer part. So when you stay in that kind of high stress, it affects you in these ways. So when a mother is stressed, the infant will also have its blood go away from its internal organs and go out to its extremities too. And that's going to affect how that child develops. And this is why physical health conditions and mental health conditions can occur even at birth. In fact, one of the things that they saw was that when a mother was really stressed out, they've even had babies come out that have ulcers, and they've even seen babies come out who have sucked their thumbs raw. And so they are absolutely living in a stressful environment. So yeah, their thumbs were actually sucked raw when they were born because they were so stressed in that moment. This is not shaming or blaming parents. This is people go through hard times, and the child also is going to be in that same environment. With fathers, since sperm continues to generate throughout the lifetime, fathers actually end up updating their genetic contributions throughout their lifetime. So the genes may mainly stay the same, but they will start to change. Like if that father's gone through trauma, they're going to have an updated version of their trauma that gets passed off to their kids. And so fathers actually have a more up-to-date version of what's happened. Mothers will typically carry what they had when they were born, and fathers will carry what they had when the child was conceived. And so you get both sets of information, one that prepares you for what's happening now, and another one that prepares you for what your parent was born into. All right. So this makes sense to everyone? So these are the mechanisms that actually contribute to intergenerational trauma. Now, there's a lot of technical information I'm leaving out, but I'm doing that on purpose because I want to leave that for questions. A couple other things that are in fact impacted by this are things like their people's attachment style. So for my father and his family, a lot of people they went through some pretty difficult times. There was a lot of wealth initially, and this was not too far after the Civil War, like when there was a lot of wealth within my father's family. But then there was a lot of racial tension that was going on at that time, and being a successful Black person at that time was frowned upon, and so like they burned down his business, and it caused a lot of stress for the family. And then so the family started to become really highly stressed, and in that stressful state, people like didn't really connect with each other very well socially. That just became a lower priority to really have these close social relationships. And so a lot of the people within my dad's family are kind of distant. I mean, to this day, I've only seen my dad's side of the family maybe 3 times in my entire life, and I'm in my 40s now, and I still haven't really seen or heard from them. It's not because they don't care, it's just everybody's gotten very comfortable living in their silos, but it's something that's gotten passed down. And so I have to be careful with that because it's very easy for me to just only focus on the family I live with rather than reaching out to the people around me. So this can affect people's social engagement and their attachment styles as well. They've also seen links between some of these epigenetic occurrences and things like ADHD and things like not just attachment styles, but even things like schizophrenia and other kinds of mental health disorders can occur because of that traumatic stress that's happened in the mother's body. One of the more famous studies has been by Rachel Yehuda, and this has been on like people who survived the Holocaust. And the Holocaust trauma studies, one of the things that they learned is you don't talk about it. And that's something that also has gotten passed down as well. And so a lot of people have just said, we don't talk about that time period. We just let it go. We let that just kind of fade into the past. And that's something that's also gotten passed down to their children. And so there's higher incidence sometimes of like depression, higher incidence of keeping a lot of things in and the stress that comes with that. You can actually see how this pattern got passed down from generation to generation. One really startling case was a therapist was working with a woman who was really chronically depressed, and she was also really suicidal. And this is not unusual as a therapist to see something like this, but her thought about how she wanted to end her life was very, very specific. She said, like, if I die, I know that I want to be incinerated. Like her brother worked at a steel mill where they would actually have molten metal that's down there that's getting stirred around. She's like, that's how I want to do it. I'm going to jump into it. I mean, like, I could not imagine, just like the thought of doing that just seems outrageous, but like she was just very convinced, and it's always been her plan is that she wanted to be incinerated. The therapist, probably kind of struggling to figure out why anybody would do this, kind of asked her a question after going through some sessions of therapy, and he asked her, it's like, well, can I ask you a weird question? Do you have any relatives who've been in the Holocaust? And she was like, no, I don't think so. And then she paused for a second. She's like, actually, you know what? Wait. Yeah, actually, my grandmother, she actually survived, and she came here as a little girl. And my aunt and my mother, they kind of had this thing where they never really wanted to talk about what happened, but maybe I should ask. And so she talked to her mother about what had happened with her grandmother. And what had happened with her grandmother is like she was only one of the only people who survived in her family, and the rest of them were incinerated. And she always felt guilty that she should not have made it through. Now, she never told this to her granddaughter, but her granddaughter now has this depressed feeling like she shouldn't be here and that she should be incinerated. That's not That's not a physical attribute. That's not, this is, again, how stories can get passed down through generations. Now, once she became conscious of it, this is why I like to share these things with people. Once she became conscious of it, it started to lose its hold on her. Oh. Because now it's like, wait a minute, that's not my story. And then she was actually able to look back at why. And so in the therapeutic process, what they did is they talked about, why is it that you think your grandmother would have felt that way? What do you think she would have needed to hear that would shift her attention or shift her mind from this idea that she owes it to her relatives to also die with them? Is that really what her relatives would want? And as she processed through that, her own desires to end her life dissipated. And it's really incredible because she probably spent a lot of that time trying to answer that question as though it was her own. But it was when she recognized it wasn't her own that she was actually able to answer it properly. So pretty incredible stuff. All right. So one of the things that I think I mentioned before is that when we have really close connections with people, parts of our brain actually communicate to each other. So instead of me telling you all like the nitty-gritty details, if you do want to know, there is a part of the brain, it's the right temporal parietal junction, but you don't have to remember that. You can just see these little colors that are banded and sticking to each other over there. Those are the parts of the brain that will actually communicate with each other and they'll actually synchronize with each other. When you are really making a connection with someone, your brain will link up with theirs and your brain will start to fire on similar brainwave patterns as the person with whom you're speaking, if you're having a really close connection. And the beauty of that is that if you're speaking to somebody who has a healed mind and your mind starts to imitate another healed mind, then guess what happens to your mind? It starts to heal. Really incredible. Right. So hopefully this is making sense. I'm trying to stay nice and clear today. All right. All right. So a couple of other things that help to start healing the brain, because now we're not just talking about intergenerational trauma, we're going to start talking about some solutions. So there's a couple of things that can actually begin to help regulate the nervous system, right? So when a child is born into a situation where mom has experienced trauma or dad has, then they can end up with a nervous system that is wired for trauma. In fact, there's a specific hormone that's affected when somebody is born to a parent with trauma. And the specific hormone is one that that you all are probably familiar with, and that's cortisol. Now, most of the time we hear about cortisol, we think cortisol is something bad. But actually, cortisol is something that's released in your body to help your body return to baseline. It's kind of like it puts out the fire, if you will. That's oversimplified, but just for our purposes today, you can think about cortisol as that chemical that kind of puts out the fire once you've been really stressed out. Now, when children are born to parents who have trauma, what happens is there's a gene. It's called a CRT, but that specific gene will get kind of turned down so that the child produces less cortisol. But if you have less cortisol, what happens is you stay in a heightened state of stress for longer. And if you remember our definitions from what PTSD is when you experience a stressor and you can't get back down. A stressor all by itself does not traumatize you. It's when you have a stressor, but you can't come back down to baseline. That's when it becomes trauma. And when you have less cortisol, the chances of you staying up too high, too long are increased significantly. So, of course, one of the things that we want to be able to do is figure out, is there a way to bring the stress levels down? How many people would like to know if there's a way to bring stress levels down? Okay, so I'm going to give you the mouse experiment, and then I'll talk about what this means in human terms. Sometimes they do nice things with mice. I guess this one isn't any nicer than the other one. So one of the things they did is they stressed the little mouse out, the pup, by separating it from its mom and kind of putting it in a strange environment. Pups don't really like that any more than newborns don't like that, and little small children don't like that. And so when they separated them, of course, the pups would have a stress response, and then they would do little blood tests on these little pup mice to see like, oh, how stressed out are you? And so anyway, they check the blood levels and they can see the stress hormones in there. Now, what they did in the second experiment, though, is they recorded the sound of the mother mouse trying to speak to its pup. And it's kind of like the mouse version of a lullaby, because mother mice do make noises to try to soothe their little infants. And what they found is that just by playing the sound of mother's voice, the pups started to calm down. That's incredible. It's like just hearing the sound of mom's voice, hearing that soft little lullaby does something for them. Now, how many people here have some songs that you know that when you hear them, you just feel something inside of you just start to relax?
Yes, very much.
Not yet for some, but maybe for others, yes. One of the things that they found is that when you can hear a voice that is soothing, and when you can hear a voice that is calming and one that really resonates with you, it actually can begin to regulate your emotional system, regulate your nervous system. And what's interesting is that even just singing lullabies to children, and probably to some extent, when you do this with adults, even though that might seem a little strange, that it actually does start to change how you read your genes. Because remember, epigenetics is not the instructions you have, it's how you read them. If you have the kind of experiences that can be healing, like in this case, kind of hearing that soothing voice that you trust, and that presence that you trust, then it can start to have a healing effect. I also believe this is part of the reason why some people really experience a lot of healing from their faith. Because for some people, God becomes that figure for them. He becomes that attachment figure, that person who has that voice, if you will, that way of connecting with them. But for other people, they find it in different places. Maybe they find it from their therapist, they find it from other relationships in their lives. But even just having these relationships where there is that soothing voice, even just the sound of a soothing voice can begin to help regulate your nervous system. All right, so I'm gonna skip this one here. There are some things that we can talk about as far as like personality disorder. These are actually things that seem to have an epigenetic effect. If a child is born to a parent who does experience like really severe depression or trauma, then the chances of being born with borderline personality disorder go up. So mental health disorders definitely have a genetic connection with them. But again, genes are not destiny. They definitely influence, but they are not destiny for us. This particular article was looking at some of the spiritual influences on early trauma. So this, I'll just read this quote to you. It says, adult survivors of early trauma experience worse mental and physical health. However, specific characteristics like forgiveness, gratitude, positive religious coping, intrinsic religiosity, these were protective against poor mental health. So even if somebody got a rough start, if they could include these things like gratitude, forgiveness, and what they call intrinsic religiosity. Intrinsic religiosity is different from extrinsic. Intrinsic religiosity is when somebody believes something because they truly believe it, whereas extrinsic is because it's culturally appropriate to believe it, or because my mom and dad believe it, or this is what I'm supposed to do. For those people, religion did not benefit them at all. It was not protective for them. It was only protective for people that intrinsically believed it, really believed it for themselves. So just food for thought. So the findings support a holistic perspective in the care for childhood trauma survivors, which I think is absolutely incredible. If there's nothing else that you've caught so far from all these presentations, it's that trying to treat trauma requires coming at it from multiple angles. It's not just talking, it's not just walking, it's not just diet, it's not just exercise, it's not just social relationships, it's all of them. Because trauma has to be treated from every conceivable angle. And the reason for that is that trauma affects development. Like, you know, something like depression can affect how I feel today and like about a specific situation, but trauma digs so deep into it, it can actually uproot who we used to be as people. And this is something that I know, especially when I work with veterans, they say the same thing. And a lot of times it's like, I don't even feel like I'm the same person that I was before I walked into this whole situation. And it's because it's dug deep into that developmental parts of who we are. It's dug deep into that attachment system. And so it actually has to be treated from all of these different angles all at the same time. All right, so this makes sense to everyone?
Yes.
All right. So let's take a look at the narratives, because this is another angle that we can have an influence on this. So first, we talked a little about how lifestyle can be impactful here. Second, we've talked about how relationships can be a healing factor. Third, we've talked about how even just things that help to create a sense of soothing, like a soothing voice, a soothing song, things like this can help. Now we're going to look at this this fifth factor here, and this is narratives, right? So remember what I gave the example of the woman who had this narrative that she just wanted to be incinerated. But as we saw, that narrative did not start with her. That was a narrative that was inherited. But what do you do once you hear about these narratives? Well, let me just give a couple of examples of ones that you might be familiar with. So this is a old kind of Freudian term, but it's the term introjection. This is when something kind of just gets planted into our way of thinking, our philosophy on how life works. And one of the examples is something like boys don't cry. Anybody heard this one before? Like boys are not supposed to cry. Those are things that can kind of become introjected into us. Those are things that can kind of get planted into us as stories that we're supposed to live by. But if you really think about this, it actually doesn't make sense, because guess what everybody is born doing? Crying. And here's a fun fact. Did you know that boys tend to cry a little more intensely and more frequently than girls do? Yeah, those are great kids. You probably have seen this before, but boys tend to actually have larger emotional expression than girls do.
Wow.
And so it's so bizarre that afterwards now we're being taught like, oh yeah, boys don't do that. It's like, what are you talking about? It's like, we're the worst. Anyway, so boys actually do cry. Now, what we actually want to teach is that you can be strong and you can be resilient, but I don't know what tears have to do with resilience. Last time I checked, when I cried, it didn't take down my bench max. I can still squat and deadlift and bench about the same amount of weight, whether I cried or not. In fact, surprise, surprise, if I actually allow myself to have an emotional release, actually am stronger than if I was holding all that in, because you know how expensive it is to hold in your emotions all the time? I'm not just saying you should act out all the time, but do you know how expensive it is to like sit there and just like not cry? I spent all the way up until I was 24. I counted on my one hand how many times I cried, and it didn't make any sense because aside from having endured the spankings and all this other stuff which you were talking about yesterday, but my mom and dad had divorced, and we had to like fly back and forth between our parents. When you're a small child, you're not going to see your parent again for anywhere between 3 months and 9 months. That's an eternity when you're like 5 or 6 years old. And it hurt every single time. I still remember every time I had to walk away from my dad, and then we had flight attendants taking us, shuttling us from Germany all the way back to California and doing all this stuff. But I remember it's like, you're not supposed to cry. So I feel the water like right here on the front of my eyes, you all know what I'm talking about too. And I just like would try to find a way. I kind of lean back, hold all the tears, and reabsorb back into my body. But I made sure I kept count because I was not going to cry. Now, there was actually a change in my life that that really impacted me. And it was when I recognized that that was no longer necessary. And what made that unnecessary for me was recognizing that I can be loved and accepted regardless of whether or not I cry. And so now I don't count that anymore. I don't spend all my days crying. It's not how I spend my time, but I don't shy away from it. And I didn't include it in this presentation, but crying itself actually has healing properties. Your eyes at any given time, like at least 95% of the microbes that attack your eyeballs are being deflected by these antimicrobial chemicals that are on the surface of your eye. And so it actually is constantly fighting off that stuff. And so when your eyes produce like normal tears, just like the ones that keep your eyes wet, it can flush out any bad stuff. In fact, part of the reason why when you cut onions, the reason your eyes water is because when you're cutting it, it's letting out little sulfur molecules. And when those sulfur molecules come into contact with your eyes, it turns into sulfuric acid. And sulfuric acid isn't good for you, as you might have imagined. And so what your body does is it produces tears to wash it out. But that's regular tears. Emotional tears are quite different. They actually have more proteins in them. You can find things in there like endogenous morphine type chemicals that are in there. You can find stress hormones that are in there. And that is because when you actually have an emotional cry, what your body is doing, it actually has prolactin in it too. What your body is doing is it's flushing out the stress hormones, and it's releasing some of those feel-good chemicals that help to soothe you. In fact, one of them, the prolactin one, is very closely connected to oxytocin. And oxytocin is that thing that helps us to feel like we've got that warm hug and connection. And so it's almost like when we cry, we can have a similar experience of that warm hug. This is part of the reason why people who take morphine. It's because they talk about that high, like that warm hug. Those are the same things that are released in the tears. So a little bit of time allowing ourselves to express emotions is one way to disrupt this narrative. And if you can stop this narrative of boys don't cry, just as an example, then maybe some of that healing can begin. Because sometimes your narrative is stopping you from your healing. All right. In the Holocaust, I talked about that already, but there was this conspiracy of silence. Everybody agrees to not talk about things. That does not help heal. It just stuffs and suppresses, but it does not heal. And actually, a lot of times, leaves kids feeling confused about why they are scared of the things they're scared of, like the cherry blossom thing. They have no idea why they're afraid. They think something's wrong with them, and that's not really the case. So how do we change these intergenerational narratives? Well, first, I want to share with you that if you hear a really good story takes your body through a whole cascade of events. So one such story that I remember hearing was a story of a father whose son unfortunately had cancer, had leukemia. But the way that it started out was, Jack was looking at his boy Sam, and his boy Sam was out on the playground, and he was just as happy as he can possibly be. And it was actually the first time he felt happy in a long time because he had spent all the early years of his life on radiation. And they finally stopped the radiation. And the kid is just finally having fun. He's jumping, he's playing in leaves. He's not just laying in the hospital bed with his head pounding and just crying. He's actually enjoying himself. But of course, Jack knows something that Sam doesn't. He knows the reason why he feels normal again is because they stopped the treatment because they can't get rid of the cancer. And so he knows that these are going to be the last days of his life. And so he has this choice to make. Does he allow himself to be consumed with the grief of knowing that watching his child play is soon going to come to an end? Or does he try to make sure that these last days with his son are the best days that his son's ever experienced? And so, of course, he made the choice to get out there and to play with Sam and to make every day count. Now, if you have even the slightest amount of empathy, you can feel the emotions that come with it. And what's so profound about this is that when a story is real to us, our bodies will actually go through the process of both grieving and healing by simply walking through that story with another person. And the same thing is true when we offer our own stories as well. So during the day, we have about 2,000 daydreams per day. At least that's the estimate that's out there. That's a really large number. I don't know how you calculate that, but at any given time, we're constantly playing out stories in our head. One of the things they found is that your brain is just as active when you're not doing anything as when you are very active. So let's just say if you're doing hard math, we'll just call that 100% capacity. When you stop and you're just daydreaming, your brain is 95% as active as it was during the math problem when you're doing nothing. So what is it exactly doing? Well, one of the things that your brain is doing is it's talking to itself. It's actually communicating with itself. There's something called like the default mode network. So DMN, default mode network. And this default mode network is kind of like the mohawk of your brain. It goes right down the center of your brain. And what it's doing during those times is the right and left hemispheres and other parts of the brain are all connecting with each other and communicating. And in fact, if you look at the brain scans of somebody with autism or ADHD or schizophrenia, you can actually tell what kind of disorder they have by how the brain is talking to itself. And interestingly enough, in autism, where people really struggle with social skills and struggle with connecting with others, if you look at their brains are siloed off. It doesn't actually even communicate very well with itself. It's like the front part doesn't talk to the back part, the inside part doesn't talk to the outside part. It's like, just like how they interact socially is how the brain is interacting with itself. That's wild. With schizophrenia, it's the exact opposite. Everything is talking to everything. Like it's just constant crosstalk all the time. And if you've ever talked to somebody who's experienced a psychotic break before or has schizophrenia, you know that they will say all kinds of things that almost make no sense. If the way that a schizophrenic person talks and thinks was comparable to a house, then you would see a toilet in the kitchen and you would also see a swimming pool in the bedroom. Like everything is just like mixed up everywhere. And you can actually see these patterns in the brain. Now here's the cool part. If you actually change how you talk to yourself, you can actually start to change how this default mode network works in your brain. And it will actually start to change, when you change how you talk to yourself, you actually change how your brain wires to itself. This whole default mode network can be changed by how you speak to yourself. So to make this really practical and tangible, when you make a mistake, and like you mess something up, how do you talk to yourself? It's like, oh, you idiot, you did that. Oh, okay. Now, let me ask you a question. How long would somebody stay friends with you if you talk to them the way you talk to yourself? But think about that for a minute. Think about that for a minute. If you're talking to yourself in such a way that you could not make friends with someone else, is it any surprise that we feel so disconnected and out of control of ourselves? is it possible that how we talk to ourselves impacts how well we even get along with our own morals and decisions and things that we feel like we're supposed to do? And so one of the ways that you can begin to heal is changing how you talk to yourself. And these are things that can be inherited. Like I still remember for the longest time, I would still say things to myself that I would hear my mom say to herself, or I'd hear my dad say to me, and all these other pieces, and they weren't mean to me or terrible to me, but I just know, people go so far as they can in their own stories and they hand it off to the next generation. But I recognized how I was talking to myself and it really wasn't helpful. And so I started changing that. And so one big tip that I can give you is when you are sitting by yourself and you're just kind of thinking, like we all do, and talking to yourself, try talking to yourself the way you would to a friend. It's like, all right, man, you didn't get it this time, let's try it next time. Right? There's still an accountability in there. Like you're not just being flowery and rosy. But if you actually can speak to yourself with compassion, then you can actually begin to change how your brain is operating. If you want to take that a step further, for the more advanced ways that you deal with this, is if you think about how you would talk to your child, if you were trying to encourage them and trying to nurture and foster them, that kind of language is even more effective. If you want to take that to stage 3, what I would say is think about what it is you needed to hear as a child and how you would talk to that person and try that on. Every single one of these, and I've worked with people who have a variety of disorders, but especially with trauma, when they start changing how they dialogue with themselves, they start to heal. And the reason that happens is because that form of dialogue that they have inside will make all the differences to whether or not their emotions will actually calm down. All right. Now, I'll try to give some examples if there's time, but let me make sure that I get to the last few here. Okay, so I'm going to jump through just a couple of these just because I want to make sure that we cover what's most necessary. There's something called eudaimonia, and this is a term that comes from like some Greek philosophy, but this is the idea that one can find happiness not because of the good things that are going on in life, but because of the purpose that they believe they're here for. People who have that are high in this particular quality, people who are really high in this particular kind of quality are able to go through hard times and still find something good and purposeful and meaningful out of it. I remember hearing about a case where a gentleman, I actually was involved with the whole Boston Marathon bombing. And when the bomb went off, he was riding his bike and somebody had drove and like actually went over the bike and like caught him and like he actually was under the car. And he was holding on to the bottom of the car and like getting dragged there. And of course he had PTSD after he survived, but he had some trauma afterwards. When the trauma therapist was working with him through this, he started to look at the story a little bit differently because you can imagine he probably didn't have a very pleasant story from there. But as he began to process through it, he started thinking about things he was thankful for. And one of the first things he said that he was grateful for, one of the first things he talked about himself is like, I'm actually a pretty strong guy. I got some good upper body strength. Not everybody can hold on to the bottom of the car and not get like, drugged and crushed to death. It's like, wow, that's really a neat insight. And they did another round of the kind of therapy that they were doing, and he had another insight. It's like, wow, I am so grateful for my right leg, because even though I don't have my right leg anymore, my right leg kind of sacrificed itself, because what he did is he pushed down with that leg to prop himself up off of the ground as long as possible, and it wore that leg down, but that was the only reason why the rest of his body survived. And so now you have this horrible event, but now he's like, wow, I'm so grateful that I had this leg to save my life. You can feel the impact of that. It's the same horrible event, but now the details of the story have changed from one where like this should have never happened to me to one where now I'm grateful and I can actually look at strengths that I have and things that even the things that I've lost were a benefit to me to have them. So that resolution. And I like this thought here is this idea that all things work together for good. To actually believe that even the worst things in our lives can actually work together for good is one of the most profound things that you can tell yourself. Now, I'm not making it sound like this is like a cakewalk and it's really easy to believe this because like, somebody would say like, how on earth can I possibly think it was a good thing for my child to be abused or my child to die and all those other things. And so we're not saying that the event itself was good, but the idea is that good can still come out of it. Good can still come out of it. And that is a very different story. So we think about people who have made a major impact in this world. Like, you know, your Martin Luther Kings and like your major heroes of like whether the civil rights movements or other types of things. But it's really hard to find any cases where that person who made such a big impact did not go through some difficulties themselves. And in fact, part of the reason why they made such a big impact is because they found a way to take their terrible experience and make something good out of it. And there is such a profound difference. Some of the most powerful talks I've ever heard from people before are people who have been through it. Because they've been through it and now they want to do something about it. Now they want to share, they want to take their experiences and make a difference in the lives of other people. There's a gentleman whose daughter was killed in a drunk driving accident, and he would give classes for people who were in DUI, had experienced a DUI and had to take classes afterwards. And he always started every lecture the same way. He talked about how much he loved his daughter. He never told them the other part of it. Talked about how much he loved his daughter, showed pictures of her and how wonderful she was. And then after everybody was just like, and how much he wanted to see her at her wedding and all these things. And right when he got to the place where everybody was like starting to fall in love with this young woman, he then lets them know that she never got to do those things because of this accident, because somebody was drunk and they hit her. And he also includes in there that he forgave the person. But now what he's doing is he's taking his daughter's life, allowing other people to love her the way that he did, and then making that a reason to stop driving drunk. That is absolutely incredible. It's taking a terrible story and using it to heal rather than to perpetuate the very things that we've been through. So this extra technique, I'll just tell you what they are, but we don't have time to get into the details. The first thing is when you are looking at the problems that you're dealing with is you want to give yourself time to evaluate. When you evaluate, you want to ask yourself, when did this stuff first happen? Second one is you want to exit the blame game. This does not mean other people were not involved. This does not mean that you take responsibility for what somebody who victimized you. You don't take responsibility for their actions, but what you do is you take responsibility for your own story. It's not fair that you've received the story that you have, but you are responsible for how you read it. So the next thing that you want to do is you want to exit the blame game and start taking responsibility for it. It's not your fault that you were taught that boys don't cry, but it is your responsibility to do something to change it. So that's to take ownership. So you exit the blame game, you take ownership is the second step, and that's exactly what we were talking about just now. The last part, or the last couple pieces here is you revisit the past and the present. You allow those present events to come back. You all remember the polar bear and how it kind of had its like shake thing that it did. What it was doing is it was taking that past event, bringing it into the present, shaking it off, and then moving through it. We can talk more about that if people have questions about it, but you revisit the past and the present to work through it. And then the last part is you advance a new narrative. Just like that man who experienced a drunk driving situation, you take that narrative and you start using it to make a positive difference in your life and a positive difference in the lives of those around you. All right, so we'll stop there and I will open the floor to any questions that anyone has. I know it's a lot. Okay, all right. Questions all over. All right, let me first, do we have the microphones, roving mics? All right, so we'll get roving mics for you in just a moment here. But were there any written questions that I can take, or I think we can. I guess we can start with the questions while we're waiting. So I saw 3 hands go up in the back, so I don't know who wants to go first, but
I found it interesting when you said, see yourself as a child. One of the best therapists I ever had threw me for a loop. One of the last sessions we had, she goes, how did you feel as a 5-year-old? And what would you tell that 5-year-old that you know now to change the trauma? Oh, I won't need that, my trust. The whole world can hear. But I thought that was the most healing thing she ever did to me, because I didn't even realize the trauma I had as a 5-year-old.
Right.
Until I visited it.
Yes.
That's about 10 years of therapy and very expensive.
Yeah, no. Well, and that's for me, it's a part of the approach I use because I've seen that. Like, I've stopped asking so much about like how are you right now, but I start asking people, when are you right now? Because a lot of times when we're experiencing, especially the trauma, we're not here and now. We're back somewhere else in the past. So for those of you who couldn't hear it, so probably we do the mics too is just for the recording because then they can hear it a little bit better on the recording devices here. But the question that was asked was, the statement that was made was that being able to talk to that like child version of self can be extremely healing and therapeutic. because oftentimes we don't realize where these things started. And if we're constantly trying to solve these problems as though they just started in adulthood, we don't get at the core of the issue. But when we do get back to those places, it can really start to solve the core issue. All right, so we had one back.
So what I learned today with the self-talk, that it's never too late to start that, even with children.
Yes.
So if I teach them how I can self-talk to myself,
Mhm.
then they will learn they can do the same thing and not have to wait as an adult to learn that.
Correct, 100%. Yeah, because how we talk to ourselves is how we end up talking to our kids. And I know that that's exactly what happens anytime, especially, this is more obvious when it's something negative. Anytime I've gotten really frustrated and I've talked to my kids out of my frustration, I noticed that how I talk is just like how I talk in my head. And so if I want to change how I talk to them, I have to change here first. Exactly, yeah, so you're spot on. All right, next question here. And then we have one up front. Okay. We're good, there'll be enough time for everybody to say that.
Like two things. One is secrets, how
Secrets.
damaging. Secrets, how damaging are they?
How damaging are secrets? Did you want to pair them both? And
And then
Okay.
my other thing is, bipolar is one of those things that has a genetic component, correct?
Mhm.
Like a lot of the illnesses and, but, like I was looking for how a child of a bipolar person can, what can help them,
Mhm.
because it affects like the whole family, and it even got to the point where this bipolar person said her son was bipolar when he really wasn't, knew he wasn't, and had convinced people to put him on medication for
Right.
bipolar disorder.
Yeah.
So
yes,
I couldn't find anything on how to help the child with somebody. I'll talk about the genetic.
yes, 100%. Okay, so start with the secrets one first. So can secrets be bad? 100% they can. Some of the people that I've talked to, even the abuse they endured was not as bad as the fact that they had to keep it secret. And oftentimes the reason why kids are asked to keep it secret is so they don't shame the family. But that is a extremely unfair burden to put on a child, because now that child has to walk around being scarred for the rest of their life so everybody else can live with it. Like, like if we thought about this in terms like physical terms, would you ever make a 6-year-old carry around a 400-pound backpack because you didn't want anybody else to look silly wearing it? Put the backpack where it belongs. It does not belong on the child. So the secrets that people keep absolutely can be damaging. Absolutely can be damaging. That doesn't mean you tell your kids every detail about everything, but you do want to tell them things that impact them, things that are actually relevant to them, and you want to make sure they have a voice to speak about the things that have happened to them. For the second part with the bipolar disorder has a genetic component, but here's a really interesting thing is that bipolar disorder in identical twins who are genetically identical only happens 40% of the time for both of them. Which means that there is a non-genetic component. If it was purely genetic, it would happen 100% of the time because they're 100% genetically identical. So there's actually a behavioral or lifestyle intervention that makes the difference between whether or not somebody actually develops bipolar disorder. So Dr. Medley, who's at the clinic, who is down there at Weimar and runs the depression clinic and is a very talented, intelligent physician. I got this statement from him. I'm not sure if he was the first one that said it, but he said that genetics load the gun and lifestyle pulls the trigger. This applies to mental health as well. So something that you could do for a child who's in a home where somebody has bipolar disorder is they need to learn how to be able to set boundaries for themselves, which is very difficult because one thing that's completely missing from somebody with bipolar disorder as well as borderline is there are no boundaries. Like everything is fluid. Like the child can be just as responsible for the household as the parent is. And these things are interchangeable. That's why the child can have like a disorder projected onto them. And so a lot of what these children need is to be able to have real boundaries and to be able to have support in fostering their own individuality, understanding who they are outside of their parent. They don't have to, because children will oftentimes try to take responsibility for making their parent healthier. And so it's a lot of that kind of work. There's more details, but yes. Yes.
Yeah, I got one of you on here.
Yeah.
I'm good into one of these.
Yeah, it sounds good.
But we'll cover a little bit of. What you've said, talking to a total stranger is sometimes better than talking to somebody that knows you. because, you know, your friends, your family, you know, that most of the time they're gonna agree with you. For the majority, you know, take senses or anything like that, so. But anyhow, and you know, the, video gaming acting out. You know, that's, where you've got, you know, I'm gonna go around here and there, click this and kill this and spray that.
Mhm.
And, you know, brash straight talk. That's what I do. I call it the way I feel it and see it.
Mhm.
You know, because I don't want this youth, this young man, this young lady to go down those trauma roads. And, you know, question at the end of this is, you know, if you can take your most worst traumatic instant in your life and find God. And if you do, you start doing better. For me.
Yeah, definitely, yeah, no, traumas themselves can, because they're so intense, there's no way for it to be written into a story in a way that's neutral. But it doesn't have to be negative. And in fact, I think the only thing that we can do with it that would actually make a difference is to find what is that good thing that can come from these challenges.
Yes, I have two items. One is about twins.
Mhm.
The other is about people who told me things that happened to.
Mhm.
Now with the twins, I can remember my uncle's wife, she was a twin.
Mhm.
But it always seemed like the incidents that happened between them, they were identical twins. It was during the Second World War, they both married at the same time.
Mhm.
And she said to her sister, or to her sisters, to the husband, can you find one just like that for me?
Mhm.
So I just find it very interesting with the identical twins, and I had never really resolved that it's one egg that's split.
Yeah.
Because that's very deep. So they kind of resolve each other's issues in a certain kind of way.
Yeah, it's one person split in two, and it's such a weird idea, but any one of you could have been two people, and it's just.
And they reflect, in a loving way too.
Yeah, yeah.
Very
No, that's
deep
positive that they have that.
what God does.
Mhm.
Now, the other comment that I had was about war, and many of us whose fathers were in a war, we heard more about the war as a victory, the
Mhm.
Second World War.
Mhm.
And, the when Berlin Wall came down, that was sort of the change after those decisions that had been made at the end of the Second World War. But we knew little really of, in my generation's fathers, we knew that the mothers were battling it out at home, whether at jobs or just trying to survive, in the sense of our country had turned into a wartime country. And nothing was convenient because everything was processed for the war. And I think my mother told me those stories much more deeply.
Mhm.
Traveling and being on a train that was all soldiers, and kind of whether or not she was safe, and then trying to drive across the country, and the only thing available was retread tires, and two children with her and things like that. With my father, it was only and my mother said, that they were living in South Carolina at the time, and they have this custom there, the houses kind of have like an inner garden where people can be outside on a railing, and that he was walking, dreaming, and he started holding onto the railing, and like he was in the middle of a fight on a ship or something like that.
Yeah.
And things like that. But as far as the actual stories, even my brother Walter, who was in the Navy for quite a while, not a lot of stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the sense of those being buried and the generations
Mhm.
that we have, I would say in my family, they were willing to go and fight.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, that we, maybe we arise as fighters, but at the same time, we could be quarrelers too.
Yeah. So even if a story is buried, there still is a way to kind of discover what it is, even if the people aren't allowed to tell you. But anyway, we can always get into that. Somebody has a question about it, but there is a way to even recover those kind of stories. But okay. All right, so it might be good to go ahead and take a break because we have another session that we'll be doing in about 15 minutes here. We might give an extra 10 minutes to make sure people can kind of breathe clear head. But for our last presentation that we'll be doing for today, we're going to be looking at trauma treatments. And we're going to look at different kinds of effective treatments that can be used. And also we'll make sure to cover treatments that have some more questionable things about them, but you're likely to encounter them if you go out there and check into them. So let's go ahead and take a brief break, and then we'll come back for our last section, and we'll have time for any additional questions that maybe we didn't get to answer this time. So, all right, so we'll see you in a little bit.